welcome to the Push-Pull Sales and Marketing Podcast. I'm Marcello.
And I'm Sherry, and each episode will provide you with sales and marketing strategies that you can implement immediately into your own business. Today, Paul Smith is back, and Marcello is speaking with him this time. If you want to listen to his previous episode, you can go to episode 31 or search pushpullsales.com for Paul Smith, and you'll be able to find my interview with him there. But Marcello and Paul are going to dive a little bit deeper into Sell with a Story and some of the specific techniques that Marcello's already been implementing, and he is a big fan of the book and the techniques, and, it's just great to talk with Paul. He's a great guy. So I will let them get to it, and I'll touch base with you afterwards.
All right, so we have the author of the latest book here, Paul Smith, again, for a deeper dive into his book. He wrote Sell with a Story, also same author of Lead with a Story, and I believe you have two other podcasts. So you have Lead with a Story podcast, you have Parenting with a Story podcast, and you're going to have another podcast rolling out too, correct?
Yeah, probably one based on the new book, Sell with a Story, where I'll have salespeople on as guests and share their stories and things like that. That's the plan now.
Okay, very cool. And you are an ex Procter & Gamble guy. You've been there for how long in your career?
Yeah, 20 years, up until about 3 years ago when I left to do this full time.
Okay, so you're doing this full time. So right now, what you're doing is you help coach not only leaders now. So you're also helping coach salespeople in terms of using stories to become a lot more effective in terms of their presentation, in terms of closing, in terms of retention. So pretty much integrating stories as part of the overall sales process, the actual before, the during, and the after. Is that correct?
Right, yeah. So it's one of those strange kind of deals where I probably spend most of my time doing the research for and writing the books that I write. Mm-hmm. But my major revenue model is the coaching, training, keynotes, seminars that I teach on the art and the craft of storytelling for leaders and salespeople, et cetera.
Very cool, very cool. And one thing I can definitely say, and I can't say it enough about your book, I really, really, really like the book. And it came to me at a time where I didn't even think I even wanted to read a sales book. I don't normally admit this. Like I'd never really gotten into a point in my career where I felt like I really need a vacation, or I'm kind of feeling it. But I had a couple other vacations. Actually, not a couple. I had one other earlier vacation that I actually had to cut short. I had a last-minute client meeting, someone I've been trying to get a hold of forever, and I was in upstate New York, and this was like my one chance to get an appointment with them. I drove 6 hours back to go see that client, and then I drove back to upstate New York to be there for maybe a day and a half to drive also back 6 hours. So when I got your book in the mail, it was like a week after my actual vacation. Yeah. When I didn't have any sort of interruption, I was like, "Wow, I don't really want to do anything salesy for." And that never ever happened to me. And I picked up your book. I started reading. I couldn't even put it down, and it's probably because it is all stories. And I can tell you, I don't read nonfiction or anything like that. So if I try to unwind and stuff like that, I don't normally. If I'm doing something for personal development or I'm doing something to help my sales team, I don't normally do that on my actual off time, if that makes sense. So
it does. Yeah, I'm very flattered that you would spend some of that time reading my book, and I know exactly what you mean. The truth is, most business books are boring. All kinds of business books, not just sales books, and so that's just one thing that I swore off that I wouldn't do with any of the books that I write. Is I'm not going to write a boring book, and the easy way to do that is I don't just preach storytelling. I use it as the vehicle to teach. So I think I'd be hypocritical if I didn't. So yeah, all of the books that I write are full of stories to illustrate each of the points that I'm trying to make and to show people how to use storytelling. So yeah, it's a lot easier to write an engaging book when it's 70% stories than when it's 90% lecture and 10% examples.
Exactly, or where the book might only have, and that's what I like about the book so much. It's not just one premise and then so much trying to go ahead and actually defend that premise. I kind of get that too, because you don't need to. I mean, people aren't going to buy. If I would have saw this book, Sell with a Story, and I would have saw it was like, I don't know, 15 pages. There's nothing in it. I'm not really going to read that. People like to have, a lot of information. But a lot of the books out there, it's just one premise, and then you're just going to rinse and repeat 100 times. This has enough meat to it and also stories where it is a really nice balance. So one of the first questions I wanted to roll into, and so I read your book, and then I went on your website. I downloaded your little worksheet, which is the 25 stories salespeople need. And I shared that with my sales team, and they said, I really need to do 25 stories. I really need to have 25 stories. How do you come up with that number? Was that narrowed down from a bigger number? How'd you end up at 25?
Yeah. So first of all, I feel your team's pain, and let me relieve some of that pain right now. It probably says somewhere on that sheet or in the book, 25 stories that all salespeople need, but that word "all" is clearly too strong of a way to put it. There are 25 stories that a lot of salespeople need, or here's 25 stories that if you're a salesperson, you're going to need most of these, but you need to figure out which ones are the ones that you need for your particular job. So yeah, first thing is, don't feel pressure that I've got to have all 25. There may be some that are just not relevant for you, but the right number for most salespeople is not 4. It's not like, I just need 4 stories. That's all I need. Like, probably not. And the way I found that out, and the way to answer your question, the way I got to the 25 was I interviewed for this book salespeople and professional procurement people at over 50 different companies. So, companies like Microsoft and Costco and Xerox and Abercrombie and Fitch and Hewlett-Packard and Kroger and, dozens and dozens of companies. And I was looking for where in the sales process are great salespeople telling stories, real stories, right? Not just making a sales pitch. And what I was just totally pleasantly surprised by, is that they were using it throughout the entire sales process, right? So from as early as introducing themselves to a new prospect, to building rapport with the buyer, to the main sales pitch, to handling objections, to closing the sale, and even a service after the sale. And throughout all those phases of the sales process, I was taking note of what stories are being told and where do they belong in the sales process, and what do those stories accomplish. And I settled on across that entire sales process, 25 unique types of stories that I was hearing repeatedly from several salespeople or from buyers who were telling me, I'm hearing these stories from the salespeople calling on me, and they're really effective. And so I just, I ended up literally with hundreds and hundreds of stories that I collected after interviewing all these people. Mm-hmm. And I just grouped them into the logical groups. What were these stories trying to accomplish? Like the very first story that most people use is a story to explain to somebody what it is that they do for a living, as opposed to saying, well, I'm the logistics coordinator for a best-in-class company that optimizes the logistical process between the core manufacturing center and the desired consumer experience, or some other set of mumbo-jumbo words that nobody knows what the heck that means anyway, right? So telling somebody a story, well, okay, let me explain what I do. So here's what I did last week. I had a client that had this problem and this, and I did this, and I did this, and here's how it turned out. Okay, all right, okay, now I get it, right? So that's a very simple story that you might craft that helps somebody understand what in the world it is that you do for a living that they can't understand by just reading your title or looking at your business card. So that's story number 1 out of 25 is explaining what you do for a living in a simple way. That's your first story that you need to have, all the way through to the like I said, the stories that go through all the rest of those. And so the other thing I would say to put your team at ease is you don't have to have all these tomorrow. Right. I have that list of 25 in the back of the book that's like sometime over the next couple of years, you need to be collecting these stories, right? And don't it's not something you're going to accomplish tomorrow afternoon. You're going to have to do some research and ask around and talk to people. It takes work to go find all of these great stories, but once you've got them, you're going to have 25 great stories in your head for just about any situation that can come up in a sales call. You'll have the right story to respond to it.
Yeah, you definitely have that on point, that you don't need it right away, and that was one of the things I had mentioned too. So I gave maybe, for example, I wouldn't even think about this like you have the "You're not who I think I'm not who you think I am" story,
right?
Like that one. So that really applies mainly to only one of my sales reps. So a lot of my sales reps come from different industries, mm-hmm. but I do have someone who came on board. He used to work for another trucking company, and for the most part, in terms of the industry, trucking companies, every rep, they go from one company and they talk about how great that company is for maybe like 1 or 2 years. My ops manager, he's kind of funny. He calls it assisted living until the company kind of figures out, hey, this guy isn't really doing anything. And then he moves on to another company and the competitor, and then he'll go ahead and kind of bash that. And I kind of said, you need to be prepared, because what's going to happen is other people are going to come in, because if you're calling on some of the same customers, or some of the other sales reps are going to come in and basically say like, he jumped ship. He was only there for, he's only there for a year.
Right.
He's just saying that because he's at a new company. I'll just wait a little bit, and I bet you he's going to be somewhere else. I was like, you need to have a solid answer for that, because and a lot of times people don't even think about that. Like, all right, I think about what I'm going to say so much, and not so much what my competitors are actually talking about me.
Right. Yeah, and so in fact, what that makes me think about is in my training courses, what I do after I'm done with the day or the half-day training course is I put people on what I call an aftercare program, and I need a sexier title for that. But basically, what that means is over the next 6 months after I teach a class, every 2 weeks I send them a prompt to have them think of a new story, to develop it using the tools that I taught them in class, and then think of an appropriate time to share it at work or during a sales call or something, so that they can practice using these tools. So it takes 6 months for me to cycle through, to prompt them to go think of all these stories. So yeah, it's not like you got to have these day one, but I think you're going to want them. And in fact, one of the other reasons why I think it's important to have a list like of 25, not of 4, is that most of the salespeople I talk to told me all the kind of stories that they typically use, and they only had 5 or 6 or 7. So I might talk to you, and you'd had numbers 1 through 7, and then I'll talk to somebody else, and they've got number 8 through 15, and somebody else has number 16 through 25, and somebody else has 1 and 7 and 19, and and when I ask them, why don't you have a story to help resolve objections, or why don't you have a story to negotiate price, or why don't you have a story to create some urgency to close the sale, I would get answers like, oh, well, I didn't know you could use a story for that. I just use it for building rapport, or I just use it for introducing myself to the buyer. I didn't know you could. I didn't know there was such a thing as a story I could tell to do that. And so now that that's part of why I put them all in the book is, look, you really could be using stories for many more purposes than you probably are today. Almost certainly every salesperson listening to this has got 4 or 5 or 6 stories that are their go-to stories that they are already using. But what you can learn from this is there's lots more that I could be using if I just thought about it.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that's one, you covered something else I definitely wanted to cover tonight. How to not basically have this be the whole day after training. So you've definitely been through that too, and then managers definitely run that through. That they have training, and the next day they're all gung ho to share with the entire sales team, to share with the entire operations team. And then 2 weeks later, any sort of initiative or anything like that, yeah, what were we talking about training? Yeah. and it kind of goes to the wayside. So you actually follow up. You have email. You said it's email prompts?
Yeah, so that's what I use now, and it's every 2 weeks for 6 months you get this email with 2 things in it. One is that prompt to think of a new story, and I tell you which stories like this. So now it's story number 17, resolving objections, or story number 12, or whatever, and I ask them a question that will help them think of what that story would be, and then prompt them to develop it using the tools in the class. The other thing in it is typically just a deeper dive in one of the techniques that we learned in class, or that we didn't have enough time to go through, or that I wanted to go deeper on. So 30 or 40 minutes every couple of weeks of work that they have to do. And I did that because I realized exactly what you said, which is most people that try and learn a whole bunch of stuff in a single day, if they don't use it over the next few weeks, they'll completely forget it all. So that's my way of solving that problem.
How many people studied Spanish for 8 years and can't speak a word?
Exactly, because they don't speak it. Yeah.
Yeah. So one area in terms of stories and thinking about what my listeners would want to hear, and I was looking through which ones are the most listened to podcasts. One of the top ones always is Objections. In terms of objections and stuff like that, a lot of customers will have not necessarily. And I'm saying customers, a lot of salespeople wouldn't have necessarily a story built into their repertoire, but pretty much what they'd have is more along the lines of an actual closing technique. One of the most frustrating things for salespeople overall is when someone wants to go ahead and stick with the actual status quo. So how do you kind of how do you craft stories that might create more of an actual sense of urgency? So you're dealing with the actual decision maker, you're talking to them, you have a solution that can possibly help them out. And he's like, you know what, this is just very, very low on my priority list right now. How can you use this story to kind of get over that? Because for that, it's kind of frustrating. It's like, well, logically it makes sense. Emotionally, I'm trying to create that, but you kind of understand where he's coming from too. Yeah, you definitely have some other things, and you're just one aspect of that. How can you use story, or how do you craft that? How do you get over that?
Yeah, so two different things I heard there. One is resolving objections in general, and I think you need to have objections resolution stories, but you normally don't just throw those out there. You have to wait till that objection comes up. And the objection might be your price is too high, or your delivery is too slow, or your quality is too low, or whatever, after you've already made your sales pitch, and you have to wait for that objection. And then you've got a story to respond to each of those. But the one that you're asking about, which is story number 20 on my list, which is creating a sense of urgency. That's for when basically you had a fabulous sales call. They say, man, I need exactly what you're selling. I like your solution. I like your company. The price is right. I like everything about it. I'm definitely going to buy this from you, but not today. I need to wait 6 months for this to happen, or a new budget to come in, or my boss to do this, or what, some other thing. Not objecting about anything about what you're selling. It's just not today, but I promise later. And that's when you need this creating a story to create a sense of urgency. And so one of the examples in the book is from a woman that worked for a software solutions provider that did accounts payable software and accounting type stuff. And she would often get that response, oh man, I definitely need what you've got, but not now. We need to wait 6 months or whatever. And so what she started doing was telling them a story about one of her previous prospects who said the same thing, love what you're selling, but not today, and decided to wait 6 months. And she told the story about what happened. Well, what happened was 3 months later, they got acquired by a much larger company. And this is, again, the accounts payable department is who would be buying this software. And their company acquired a smaller company. And so what happens when that happens is the accounts payable department of the acquiring company typically takes over all the responsibilities of the smaller company. Now you've got to pay the bills for both companies, and they basically fire the new department, right? That's how you downsize. That's how they make these acquisitions work. So all of a sudden their workload doubled like overnight. Well, now they don't have time to do any kind of installation of any fancy new software. And she gets on the phone with them when she finds out about this. And what they said was basically, I really regret not buying your software 3 months ago, because if we had bringing in all of these new suppliers that we have to put into our AP system would have been so much easier with your system than with the old dinosaur we've been using. So I definitely am not going to have time for the next 6 months. But if I'd done it 3 months ago, I wouldn't be pulling my hair out now. I wouldn't have had to hire 2 more people. My best AP person wouldn't have quit because of the workload, and all these problems that happened because I waited. Right, so she just tells that story about the problem that happened when somebody waited, and they regret it, and they wish they had bought sooner. And that just helps the person you're talking to realize, oh yeah, things like that happen all the time. It may not be that particular problem, but if this is a good solution, it'll be a better solution now than it will be later, because it's going to solve problems that I don't even know I have yet.
Yeah, and you definitely bring up a valid point. I remember reading that section because something similar is happening to one of my sales reps. Obviously, for confidentiality reasons, I can't say who, but one of my customers one of my sales reps' customers, one of their prospects, got bought out by a very, very large company. And part of the acquisition was specifically to help with the company's supply chain logistics and to help manage that and to help cut costs and to help improve their presence within North America. Which is funny because the company that they were with before has a very, very smaller presence in the market, whereas my company can actually service all the customers' needs, and that's exactly what we were trying to accomplish for them. So now she finds herself trying to move things along and everything in terms of the process, and no one knows what's happening because basically they bought out these 2 companies for that specific purpose. So as soon as you have the bigger management coming in, and it's kind of funny how that actually works out. And now she has that story. It's like, the funny thing is that this company got acquired for the specific purpose, and they're going to change everything, and things are going to move along to streamline all their supply chain and logistics and all that good stuff. And had they been working with us, they wouldn't be in a position where they're really scrambling to cut costs and to kind of do everything, where it doesn't make sense to go right ahead and make a change.
Right. And see, now they should share that story. You should, disguise the names of the companies and all that stuff you have to do for confidentiality. But you should share that with the rest of the sales reps that work for you, because then all of them could have that story at their fingertips to whip out at exactly the right time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, 100%. So I thought about that. I'm like, man, this is almost a perfect parallel.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of that, so you're talking about when you have to create that sense of urgency, you call that's number 17 or number 20?
I think that's 20. But
you have this down pat.
I got a list here in front of me I can refer to. So I'm cheating. You can do that when you're doing podcasts like this.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I have the book here. I have things, I have things dog-eared and starred and all that
Beautiful
good stuff. All right, so taking a deeper dive into that. So that is when you utilize that story. What about in the beginning, maybe when you're trying to get someone's attention? So you're trying to create an actual need. What kind of story would you do that? Because, again, a lot of times you might run into, for most sales reps, if they're going to lose a deal, it's going to be because it's not always on price. It's going to be because I'm going to stick working with who I'm working with now because I'm not really having any problems, or it's pretty much good enough, or if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right.
What kind of stories, or how do you kind of craft that? I'm sure you have the exact number.
Yeah, number 13, right?
Number 13. All right.
Yeah, problem story. So if your prospect doesn't think they need what you're selling, it's because they don't think they need what you're selling. You need to help them understand that they need what you're selling, and that's what a problem story does. It's a story about the problem that somebody has that your product or service is designed to fix. And so, for example, I think the example I use in the book is this guy that sold internet security protocols to banks. So, and when he would go on a sales call, he would usually tell the story about himself. Last year, he'd say, last year I went to Las Vegas to some industry conference, and of course, while I'm there, I'm going to take in the Vegas nightlife like everybody else. So the conference is over 5 o'clock. I go have dinner. I start to hit the casinos. I'm winning some. I'm losing some. I'm winning some. I'm losing some. I'm losing more. I'm losing more. And now I'm out of money. And so it's 1 o'clock in the morning. I go to the ATM machine. I got to get out some extra cash because I'm having too much fun. And my transaction gets denied. And I think I just typed in the wrong number. I do my password again, denied again. Try a different machine, denied again. It's like, okay, I know what's going on. I live in New Jersey. All of a sudden I'm in Las Vegas. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm trying to get a boatload of cash out. My bank thinks that somebody stole my credit card. He said, I don't mind that. I don't mind my bank trying to look out for me. What I mind is that they called my wife.
At 4 a.m., I love that.
Exactly. 4 o'clock in the morning, New Jersey time, they call my wife. And can you imagine what that sounded like on her end of the phone? Well, Mrs. Moulton, sorry to wake you, but your husband is in Las Vegas at 1 o'clock in the morning trying to get a boatload of cash out of a machine. Do you approve that transaction? He said, I was livid, right? Anyway, so he'll tell that story about all the trouble he got in with his wife and how he was so mad at his bank. And, he said, why didn't you call my cell phone? You've got my cell phone number, Anyway, he said, you've got customers that are probably having problems like this all the time. You just don't know it because you never hear about it, right? And so he'll tell them stories like that, and they'll go, "Oh yeah, I don't know what our protocols are for that, or they probably are, to call the home and get approval, which is what everybody does." Well, we have smarter solutions than that. We have a solution where they call your cell phone, or we send them a text with a temporary password, and
yes.
and this probably happened years ago before this was the common solution, but you can imagine a more updated story like that. So that is a problem story to help your buyer understand the problems that they may not even know their customers are having that your solution can provide for them. So you've got to have stories like that in your repertoire.
Oh yeah, and one I can tell you it is now a text because I had a similar story to that. So I went with I took the company vehicle. I went to go drive to see a client. It was like 4.5 hours away. So my meeting's at 2 o'clock. Right before the meeting, of course, something happens. I get something in the side wall of the tire. So right before, I have them patch it, all that good stuff. And then I'm like, well, I really don't want to stay in a hotel. I'd rather just drive back home tonight because my meeting was only an hour. So sure enough, my accounting lady, because after all this, I go back and forth. I try to find a different tire place that has that size tire so I can swap out the tires and have that done. There's a Walmart in Newcastle, Pennsylvania that actually has that size tire. They have it in stock. So then my accounting lady, she sends me a text message and she says, actually, no, she called. She says, did you just try to spend $300 in groceries at Newcastle? And I was like, trust me, if I was going to use, yeah, I'm like, how'd you know? Yeah, if I'm gonna improperly use the company expense card, trust me, I'm gonna use it for something much more exciting than spending $300 on groceries.
It's gonna be millions of dollars, and you'll never see me again.
And you'll never see me again. But yeah, she said, yeah, I got a text message like, is this legit and stuff like that, which I definitely appreciate it coming in as an actual text message, because over the phone it seems kind of weird.
Right.
But yeah, that's I love the stories, and it definitely helps things stick. How do you feel about, and we talk about creating an actual sense of urgency, and what I did, I actually, and I think Sherry covered that in her podcast, I adapted your little Procter & Gamble story.
Which one?
Because for my company, we get confused with Procter & Gamble all the time.
Right, you're right.
So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, so I work for P&G, P, the letter N, and G, and I get confused with Procter & Gamble all the time. Now, about 20 years ago, Procter & Gamble came out with a product, and what the product does is it actually removes odors, and actually removes them from the product, or it removes them from the fabric and all that good stuff. It doesn't actually mask the odor. Now, when that product first came out, how do you think it did? Everyone I talked to is like, wow, well, it must have done really well. It was backed by Procter & Gamble. Mm-hmm. I was like, actually, no, it didn't work at all. And they're like, why is that? And I was like, well, because people became, quote unquote, and now that's new Procter & Gamble advertising, nose blind to that. Mm-hmm. So people have become so accustomed to that. So I use that now to create a sense of urgency. I actually bring a thing of actual Febreze to kind of like, what the hell is this guy bringing in Febreze for? I was like, that's kind of similar to what my company does right now. You have certain issues, and it's kind of hard too, because you don't want to be like, well, what you're doing now kind of sucks. It's not really the best for you, but that's kind of one way that I've been using to kind of segue into that. Be like, you've been around this problem so long, you haven't actually recognized that.
Right, you're desensitized to it.
Desensitized, exactly. So
good use of that story. Thank you.
So yeah, I utilize that, and now I always have in my car a bottle of Febreze for any sort of presentation, just in case. And that one I did use, and we are still working on that one. I had to use that because my sales rep, she got an opportunity with a customer, and it's a family-owned company, and we got to meet all the actual decision makers, but the one partner in the business was the one that would eventually have to talk to his father, who's only there part-time, and the other partner in the business. So I was like, well, I need this guy to remember me. I need him to remember my company. I'm going to need to do something that actually stands out. So kind of transitioning to that. So when you're talking about selling and stories, and you do, and I don't know what number it is, but when you actually have an advocate or what do you call it? Sponsor.
I call it a sponsor, yeah.
You call it a sponsor. All right. So when you have a sponsor, do you recommend, if possible, to basically craft a story for each individual and kind of divide and conquer in terms of the whole? I'm not sure. Have you ever read the book The Challenger Customer?
I know about it, but I haven't read it myself.
At one point, he talks about, it's a lot harder to sell now because you have so many different stakeholders in an actual business. So it's kind of like spinning plates. So you get one plate spinning, and you get one person's, approval, and then you go to the next person, you get that plate spinning, and by the time you get to the third person, the actual, you have the first plate, it's kind of wobbling. If you kind of know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So is your recommendation then just do everything in terms of right into the actual sponsor? Do you try to craft something for each individual, especially when you have something? Because a lot of your stories work very well when you have everyone all together at once. What do you do when you have multiple decision makers all in the same process?
Yeah, so and I know that happens a lot, which is why I have that type of story in there. When you can't get in to see the final decision maker, what you want is for whoever it is that you do get to spend time with, in the sales call, to take all of your sales materials and your sales pitch and your presentation and your fancy brochure and all of that stuff and go deliver that sales pitch for you, just like you would to the CEO or the board of directors or whoever it is that you can't get in to see.
And that's never going to happen.
And it's never going to happen, right?
Yeah.
But what people, because they can't remember it all, they don't want to walk in with all that stuff, they don't have access to it, whatever. For whatever reason, they're just not going to do that. But what they can do is remember a story. And that's one of the benefits of storytelling is it's just so easy to remember stories. It's, facts are just not as memorable, a list of facts as a single story that might have all those facts in it, but it's told in terms of a story. So if you tell your sponsor a story in addition to your sales pitch, the odds are they'll walk into that meeting and they'll tell your story. But if you only give them the sales pitch, they'll walk in and they'll say, well, I really think we ought to buy this thing. I can't remember why, but we should really buy whatever. They're not going to do your sales pitch very well, but they can easily tell your story. So you're going to want them to have that story that they can take with them. And it could be it could be the same one. If you've got 3 or 4 contacts in the company, it might even be better if it was the same story. That way, at least one of them will remember it, or they can finish each other's sentences or whatever. And maybe one of them will remember some of the sales pitch and the other 2 will remember the story. But you're going to want to have them get them more than just your sales pitch.
Good. And then, and I mentioned it, and then I went back and I forgot about it again. In terms of visuals, so do you recommend just you talk about delivery, and if you're telling an emotional story, you definitely want to leave things flat. In previous sales trainings like corporate visions, sales brand, they talk about using mini dramas and props and stuff like that. How do you personally feel about that?
So for visuals, 2 things. One, if you tell a great story, you don't need any visuals. Right? I mean, just imagine, the guy telling a great story over the water cooler. There's no PowerPoint over his shoulder. There's no props. It's just a great story, right? And that's the beauty of a great story is it can travel on its own without props, without slides. And that's why it travels easily. You don't have to have a memo or something to accompany it to deliver it. People just remember it and they'll repeat it. When I am teaching a storytelling course, or when I'm a keynote speaker and I have the benefit and the luxury of having a slide presentation and a projector and all that kind of stuff, I do use visuals like most people do, and I use 1 visual per story. Right. So if I were to tell you that story of, I can't remember which one I've told you, the creating a sense of urgency story about that, accounts payable, department, I would have 1 picture of a bunch of people that look like they were working in an accounts payable department, and that's it. And there might be 2 or 3 words on the slide that just reminded me of the story to tell. And the reason I would have only 1 picture and a few words is because that's all that the audience is going to remember either. And the picture just gives them a visual to associate in their brain with the story. It just makes it easier to remember. So it's not just to entertain them. It's a memory device. But if you had 5 or 6 visuals on the page and 30 or 40 words and 5 or 6 slides to tell 1 simple story, that's too much, and you're probably not helping yourself and not helping them.
Now, and that is extremely helpful. Just kind of narrowing that down too. And you also talked before, you wrote in your book about you don't necessarily have to memorize your story. You don't have to know it word for word. A picture can just prompt you like, oh yeah, and these are some of the items that I'm going to want to cover. Now, let me ask you what. Well,
let me just comment on that. In fact, I don't just say it's okay to not memorize your story. I suggest that you do not memorize your story, and the reason is because if you memorize your story, you'll tell the story in a memorized fashion, and nobody wants to hear anything that you're repeating verbatim from a script. I mean, can you imagine sitting in a sales call and the person on the other side of the table starts talking to you from a memorized lines? I mean, it's obvious that they're doing it. And it's one of the cues. In fact, this is what I learned from the buyers that I interviewed is they told me that's one of the things that makes them know that the sales pitch has started. And it immediately turns them off, right? One of them said, it makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up, right? It makes me want to vomit right there on the spot, right? I mean, you don't want to sound that way. And the best way to not memorize your story is to never write it down word for word in the first place. Just write it down in bullet points, like just the basic facts of the story in the right order, and that's what you'll remember. Then when you're ready to tell the story, you can't recite it word for word because you never wrote it down word for word. You're just remembering the general flow of the facts, and every time you tell the story, it'll be slightly different. It'll sound a little different. You'll take pauses at different places. You'll use different words, different sentences, but it'll basically be the same story, and it will sound conversational every time, and that's what you want it to sound like.
And that was a second thing that I brought up to my sales team, because first they said, all right, so you read a book, and now you have to come up with 25 stories. I was like, but you don't have to memorize them. So you're not going to need to know them word for word. You just need to know the general. You just need to know the general gist of it. Now, one thing I wanted to ask, in terms of your background, in college, were you like a stat guy? Like, because if you look in the book, you go into so much specifics. You're like, well, in terms of a readability, you want to be at a 7. In terms of words in a story, this is how many are in here, stuff like that. And how do you come up with your numbers? Well, where does everything come from?
Oh, so I think the numbers you're referring to is what's the average length of a story and a lot of the stats on.
Exactly.
Yeah, so they came from the stories that I have documented in all of my research. So I've now interviewed probably 270 or 80 executives, CEOs, salespeople, buyers, whatever, over the last 6 years. And I mean in-depth, one-on-one, 2-hour-long, interviews. And each of them has told me 7, 8, 9, 10 stories. So I've literally documented 2,000 some odd stories. And if I just take the ones that were good enough to make it into the book, so I just kind of do the math on those stories to see, well, how long are they and what's the sentence structure and, what percent of passive verbs are there in there, and just a little bit to help people craft their stories a little bit better. And what I learned was that leadership stories are on average about 4 minutes long, and they range from 2 to 5 minutes. Sales stories are half that long, right? So if you're the CEO standing out in front of your team giving a speech and you tell a story that helps them understand your vision of the future, that might be a 4-minute story inside of a 30-minute speech. If you're a salesperson and you've got a 30-minute sales call, you might tell 2 stories, and those 2 stories are going to be 2 minutes each on average. Or that's what I learned from the salespeople is on average their stories are half the length of a leader story. And the reason is because if you're the boss, people have to sit and listen to you, right?
Payday's tomorrow, yeah.
Yeah, but the buyer doesn't have to. So they have less patience, and so I found that salespeople, their stories are shorter and get to the point quicker. And like I said, 2 minutes on average. They range from about 30 seconds to about 3 or 4 minutes, but none of them were over 5 minutes. And like I said, on average, they were 2 minutes. And a lot of the other statistics are things that you can get in your Microsoft Word. If you ever write your stories out entirely, again, which I don't recommend, but if you do, Microsoft Word will do some statistical analysis of your writing and tell you, oh, your sentences are way too long. They're on average, they're 20 words per sentence, and there should be about 15, and things like that can help you with your writing.
Wait. So Word can do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
It can say your sentences are too long. Because the only time I ever use that, and I remember being not in college, but in high school, like, all right, you have to write a 3-page thing, or you got to write a 1-page thing. It's got to be 400 words or more. That's the only time I've ever used any sort of analytics in there. I'm like, all right, 405, boom, good.
Yeah, all right, let me clue you in because this is really helpful. Okay, so you've got something written in Microsoft Word. You go to Tools, Spelling and Grammar, and you run the spelling and grammar checker, and some option dialog box will come up. Check the little box that says Readability Statistics. And I think you have to check the one that says check grammar with spelling. So you're not just checking spelling, you're checking grammar. And then when it's done, it will give you a little report that will tell you the average length of your sentences. And it'll also, the other really important thing is the Flesch-Kincaid reading level. And that's, I can't remember who those 2 people were, but they were psychologists.
It figures it out?
So it calculates
native in Word?
Yeah. And
no way.
A lot of different programs have it. And you can actually go to like readabilityscores.com or something online, and you can just copy and paste whatever you're writing into it, and it'll grade your writing. But basically, it'll give you a grade level. It'll say what you've written is on a grade 10 or grade 12 or grade 15 or grade 20 or grade 30. And you might think that, well, a bigger number is better. That means I'm more sophisticated. But it's not. Right? If the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are written on a 10th grade reading level, and the reason is because you don't want your readers to have to struggle with your syntax and your complex sentence structure and your run-on sentences. You want them to struggle with the ideas, not the writing style. So you want to write on about a 10th grade level in your business writing. Great fiction writers write on about a 7th or 8th grade level. And that's because that's what people enjoy reading it, right? If you write on a 15th or 18th or 20th grade level, if there was such a thing, and this thing will tell you, it reads like a pompous, run-on, rambling mess. And people have to read what you're writing 2 or 3 times to figure out what it means. And most business people write on about a 13th or 14th level on this scale, and it's way too high, right? It's not fun to read. People don't like it. It's confusing, and so you run that, and it will tell you that you've probably written on too high of a level, and you need to get shorter sentences, more clean structure. Get your verbs to the beginning of the sentence, stuff like that. I cover some of those details in the book, but absolutely that can help not just your story crafting, but your business writing in general.
I was really impressed. I thought that you had sent off some of these stories to whatever the Flesh Kincaid, and you had them rated. And so the fact that you can just do it,
I did it myself. You can do it yourself.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And one thing I did want to cover too, and you kind of covered that as well. So when you talk about length of story and having the right length and all that good stuff, and addressing actual cultural differences. So for example, for my company, I kind of hitting both sides. So one, the owner, he's not from here. He's from Europe, so his stories tend to be longer. Two, he's also the owner, so he has your attention.
Get away with it.
So he gets away with it. So his stories are not only twice as long as my stories; it's twice as long.
Exactly.
Also because of the actual cultural difference. So how did you arrive at the ideal length? Because a lot of our listeners are basically in North America, so we're looking at U.S. and Canada. How do you arrive at the ideal length, delivery, tone, cadence, and stuff like that for someone specifically in North America?
Yeah, so most of the folks I interviewed were also in North America. I did interview some in Europe and some in Latin America, and not enough to make some big, huge statistical sample that any statistician would respect, and that wasn't my goal. But what I did find, at least anecdotally, was that in Europe, especially places like Germany, their interest in listening to stories, especially personal stories, and the rapport building part of the sales phase was very short. In the U.S., it was a bit longer, and in Latin America, it was even longer than that. Like, in fact, I had people tell me, if I have a 1 hour sales call, I could literally spend 30 minutes talking about my mom and my kids and my, boyfriend and my whatever. Like, and hearing that about them too. We could spend half our time in rapport building in every sales call in Latin America. When I do my sales call in North America, I have to cut more than half of that out. And then when I go to Germany, they won't let me do any of it, or something like that. And I've exaggerated a little bit here to make the point, but there are definitely cultural differences between the amount of certain types of storytelling. The more personal rapport building storytelling is what I'm talking about now. I think the sales storytelling is largely going to be the same. They might have a little bit more patience in the U.S. and Latin America for a problem story that lasted 2 or 3 minutes, and maybe, like I said, in Germany, maybe that you need to get that done in 45 seconds or something. I don't know, but you'll know if your folks are there, they'll pick up on that. And I think that the other difference would be the level of emotional content that they're willing to or interested in listening to. And again, it was very high in Latin America, about medium in the U.S., and much lower in certain parts of Western Europe, where folks are like, look, don't tell me too many really personal stories, because I want to keep this on a very professional level. And so that's a watch out to look for across cultures too.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I also did want to ask, and then we can kind of wrap things up a little bit. So, and it's kind of funny, we did in an earlier podcast, and that was just a little bit more informal, is basically things your customers are never going to say. You had the unique opportunity to interview so many purchasing managers, procurement people, CEOs and stuff like that, where they actually told you specifically things where they would never actually tell the actual salesperson, where one of them being, I can tell when, I can tell that you're pretty much giving me a canned pitch.
To me.
I know when you're pitching to me. How do you get salespeople away from that? Because at this point, some people might interpret this as, okay, well, I can tell more stories, I can talk more. Salespeople are already inclined to maybe be a little bit more outgoing and be a little bit more talkative, when in reality they need to ask better questions. So how do you get a salesperson to balance everything and not turn this into okay, well, now I'm just really going to perfect my pitch and not make a story? How do you make that transition?
Yeah, so good question. One thing, there's an entire chapter early in the book about how do you get the buyer or the prospect to tell their stories. And in fact, I say your first goal in your first meeting with the buyer should be to get them to tell their stories. Because if you don't, how are you going to know which of your stories to tell? And so I go through several steps for how do you get your prospects to tell you stories. And I don't just mean answer questions. I mean actually tell stories like you and I are talking about stories. And I think I give them like five ways to do that. And the first one is shut up and listen, right? If you're always talking, you're never going to get stories out of them. But the next things to go do is ask open-ended questions. Like, don't ask them, is your biggest problem this? Because the answer to that is either yes or no. Okay, well, that's nice, but that's not a story. Better to ask a question like, tell me about the moment you realized that your biggest problem was your biggest problem. Then they're going to, oh, yeah, well, that would have been last year when our third line went down because of whatever, and we lost a whole day's worth of production, and this happened, and our engineer quit, and and they'll tell you this whole story about what happened, so you can go, aha, that I can fix. But if you just say, is your biggest problem production shutdowns? Yes. Okay. I don't know where to go from there, right? That's not enough to go on, but the story is. So asking open-ended questions, and giving them space to answer is really the main two ways to do that.
Yeah, and it definitely helps the sales rep to elevate their actual questioning skills. So an average sales rep might say, okay, so are you having problems? And that's a simple yes or no. No, I don't have any problems with my current provider.
Right.
And then you're done. You say, okay, well, you might ask, okay, well, what sort of problems are you having? And then that might get a little bit better thing. But asking, okay, can you tell me about the time? Tell me about the last time your current provider had let you down, or tell me about the most recent.
No, that's a great question. That's a story eliciting question, right? That's going to get you a story, not a simple answer.
Yeah, I mean I definitely like that.
Yeah, tell me about a time when. Anytime you start a question that way, you're going to get a story for an answer.
I like that. We're definitely going to integrate that. You are the first person who we're going to have on, actually, by the time this one comes out, you are the first person who we're going to have on the podcast twice. If our listeners want to find you, they can go to, the website is leadwithastory.com.
That's right. Yeah, leadwithastory.com, just the name of the first book.
Perfect. Leadwithastory.com, and then if they want to find you, is that the best place to email, Twitter?
So Paul at leadwithastory.com, and the Sell with the Story, the new book is there, and it's on Amazon and all the places you might expect to find it, and they can find out about the training and consulting and speaking I do at that website as well.
Awesome. Hey, Paul, definitely appreciate having you on the show, and we'll definitely keep you in touch. Look forward to hearing your other podcast roll out as well.
Lovely. Thanks so much for having me on. It was fun.
Nice. Thanks, man.
So that wraps things up for the week. Thank you to Paul Smith for coming on the podcast again. You can listen to his first episode, which was episode 31, at pushpullsales.com or iTunes or YouTube or anywhere else that you listen to podcasts. Thank you to bensound.com for our intro and outro music. And thanks to you guys for listening. Be sure to order your own copy of Sell with a Story by going to pushpullsales.com/sellwithastory. That'll take you to Amazon with our affiliate link, which helps out the show and helps out Paul as well. We want to support him. We definitely recommend the book. As always, you can view show notes and other resources at pushpullsales.com. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at pushpullsales. And if you have any feedback or want to be a guest on the podcast, you can email us, pushpullsales@gmail.com. Other than that, we will talk to you guys later. Thanks.